plenary meeting. The fourth plenary meeting is called to order. Good afternoon, everybody. We will now resume the consideration of sub-item B, universality, of agenda item 11, entitled the consideration of the status and operation of the treaty under matters important for achieving the objectives and purpose of the treaty. We did not finish the list of speakers in the morning, and I now have the pleasure to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Comoros. That was a miscommunication, I'm sorry. Is Kiribati in the room? I have the honor to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kiribati, if Kiribati is ready to speak. It's also a miscommunication. In which case, I have the pleasure to call on the delegation of Chile.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. Chile welcomes the working document facilitated by Austria. We welcome the statements made by various countries, including some from the Latin American and Caribbean region, and we would like to state the following in that respect. Chile supports the ideas expressed when it comes to talking about this treaty in relevant fora, in particular the UN General Assembly in New York next September. Our country also supports an education-based focus, looking at disarmament through workshops, courses, seminars, and other activities, in particular those supported within regional frameworks, for example, OPANAL in our region. We would also like to encourage civil society to participate, as well as academia, women and young people, when it comes to these training activities. Finally, we believe that it is particularly relevant to highlight Article 6 of the treaty when it comes to female participation in universalization. And so we contributed to the working document on gender along with Ireland and Mexico. We must continue listening to the testimony of victims and other people affected by nuclear weapons and nuclear testing. President, we believe that actions like those we've talked about will highlight this idea of responsibility and commitment that we have agreed to when signing and ratifying this treaty. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the delegation of Chile, and I now give the floor to the delegation of the Comoros. Please, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, de me donner la parole.
Thank you, President, for giving me the floor, and sorry for not taking it earlier when you gave it to me. Universalization should be a priority for Comoros. It is for Comoros and for other countries when it comes to increasing the number of signatories and ratifications in order to promote the values and standards contained within this treaty. These two goals will mean that each new signature, each new ratification will strengthen the norms within this treaty, and therefore Comoros would like to congratulate states that have signed up to the TPNW, including Côte d'Ivoire, Congo, Guatemala, Cabo Verde, Guatemala and Timor-Leste. Establishing a framework for promoting this treaty to other states who've not yet signed it or ratified it by, for example, naming regional leaders or a reporting mechanism or plans of action for intersessional periods. Comoros takes its responsibility under Article 12 seriously and will look at acting through diplomacy and statements in relevant fora to raise awareness about the TPNW and the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. Given that Africa is a continent that is a driver of nuclear disarmament, Comoros welcomes the efforts made by the African Union, in particular holding an AU meeting last March by AFCOM and the African Group, calling on member states to sign and to ratify the treaty as quickly as possible. Comoros also plans to implement its responsibilities and help with universalisation of the TPNW in fora such as the African Union, SADC, the League of Arab States, and different UN fora, as well as with its partners in the region. Comoros would like to call on states who have not yet done so to sign and to ratify this as quickly as possible. The next big opportunity to do so will be during the UN General Assembly. Thank you, President.
I thank the delegation of the Comoros for this intervention and give the floor to the African Council of Religious Leaders.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the African Council of Religious Leaders, Religions for Peace, welcomes the growing international support for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Now more than ever, we must work together to strengthen the global norm that against these abhorrent weapons which threaten the very survival of humanity. Faith communities and non-governmental organizations in Africa and globally have dedicated themselves to the cause of universalizing this landmark treaty. Since the TPNW entered into force last year, we have organized dozens of workshops, press conferences, and bilateral meetings throughout Africa to promote adherence to the treaty. We have addressed parliaments, we have convened interministerial forums, we have spoken at universities and to the general public. We are delighted that many of the treaty's newest states parties are from Africa. We commend the 13 African state parties, states that have ratified the TPNW so far: Benin, Botswana, Cabo Verde, Comoros, the Republic of the Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Lesotho, Namibia, Niger, Seychelles, and South Africa. We commend also the 16 African states that have signed the TPNW and are now working to ratify it. We encourage these states to expedite their ratification processes given the urgency of our work. Earlier this year, the African Union held its first expert-level meeting on universalization of the TPNW in Africa. The sub-regional economic blocs have also taken up this cause. We note in particular the strong support of the economic community of West African states. As Africans, we are proud to call our continent a nuclear weapon-free zone. We have rejected these earth-endangering devices. Now we must reject them for the whole world. Thank you.
I thank the African Council of Religious Leaders for this statement, and now give the floor to the World Council of Churches.
Thank you, Mr. President. I speak on behalf of 144 organizations that have endorsed this joint interfaith statement. As people of faith, we express our commitment to further universalize the norms and principles of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, as they are consistent with our core beliefs of our faith traditions. As faith communities from a diversity of traditions and located all over the world, we join together with one voice to mark this first meeting of state parties on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We welcome the historic occasion and celebrate this milestone that moves us closer to the universalization of this treaty and a world without nuclear weapons. Distinguished delegates, we gather at a time where the threat of nuclear annihilation feels closer than before. So many more of us suffer from anxiety in response to the increasing threats by nuclear armed states. In the face of these urgent existential threats, we are more determined than ever to abolish nuclear weapons. We are acutely aware of the threats facing humanity and our beloved planet, from the devastating impacts of a global pandemic to the rising threat of climate catastrophe. The stake for life on Earth have never felt higher. Nuclear weapons represent a tangible manifestation of the worst of these threats, with the risk they pose to human health and environmental stability. The resources currently spent on the development and maintenance of this weapon should be directed towards supporting the most vulnerable people and protecting the planet through investing in food, education, healthcare, and climate justice. Our faith traditions call us to denounce this misuse of resources and to call for a greater international cooperation to end nuclear weapons forever. Nuclear weapons are a tool of domination and violent coercion in a time when we urgently need to prioritize human security. Our religious and spiritual tradition uphold an ethos of mutual aid, care for the stranger, and trust in the community. Our faith tradition continues to nurture the belief in a better future. We're reminded of our shared vulnerability and our shared capacity to make compassionate, intelligent policy choices. We remain committed not only to our own security, but to the security and well-being of one another. We understand the interrelationship between justice and peace, and we continue to commit ourselves to working for a world in which no community has the power to annihilate another, where the security of some does not depend on the insecurity of others. We urge the state parties of the TPNW to heed the voices of world's Hibakusha and contribute to strengthening the treaty through fully including the voices of affected communities, so that as the international community we can begin to work for healing the harms caused by nuclear weapons. We also urge all states to work for the universalization of the TPNW and invite all countries that have yet to ratify the treaty to do so in a timely manner. And finally, we urge all nuclear weapon states to act in accordance with a commitment to nuclear disarmament and take concrete measures towards reducing nuclear threats. In a world that often seems bleak, we celebrate this first MSP as a glimmer of light and hope. Just as we come together to unite our voices and prayers beyond our own faith traditions, we applaud our commitment to multilateralism and in diplomacy in a time of divisiveness and tension. We stand with you to rid the world of nuclear weapons and create a world where we can advance together for common security and mutual flourishing. Thank you.
I would like to thank the World Council of Churches for this statement, and now give the floor to Kiribati.
Mr. President and esteemed delegates, as Kiribati mentioned earlier, the Pacific region has been ravaged by the consequences of nuclear weapons. More than 300 nuclear tests were conducted in the Pacific. Atolls in the Marshall Islands, Johnston Island, Christmas Island, and French Polynesia were used as nuclear test sites, casting long shadows into the present. This legacy has motivated us to take action on achieving a world free of nuclear weapons and to advocate for a safer and saner world free of nuclear weapons. For instance, in October 1985, the 16 leaders of the Pacific declared the Pacific as a nuclear-free zone, as embodied in what is now known as the Treaty of Rarotonga. The treaty bans the use, testing, and possession of nuclear weapons within the realm of the Pacific Island Forum region. We consider the TPNW as an extension of the Treaty of Rarotonga. The TPNW expands upon the scope and parameters of prohibited activities and provides comprehensive provisions to help affected communities. Mr. President, I think the full text of my speech, a bit long, will be submitted and hope it will be available to all delegates. But let me just say, out of text, that we feel that coming here with divided mentalities, those who are affected, those who are victims, and those who kind of feel that they caused the suffering, that to me is going to prevent us from moving forward. So I would humbly request all who are here, especially those who are affected, like Kiribati, Marshall Islands, and many others, who were victims and still victims and maybe future victims. Why don't we come here and feel that we are brothers and sisters of one humanity, and that we can all come together and talk and not have any sort of a guilty feeling, especially those brothers and sisters of mine from the so-called the powerful nations who still believe in a world to be secured with weapons of mass destruction or any form of weapons. Why don't we kind of think again and say, maybe there's a better world ahead of us? Why don't we go back and think about the beginning of the world, when nature was so beautiful, everything was calm and cool and harmonious? Why don't we think like that? Can we recreate that as brothers and sisters, as people, one happy big family under one God, one creation? Can we come together and then forget about the divisions? Because sometimes these divisions will linger on and then will never bring us together. And you keep, your party is the nuclear party, my party is the affected party, and we're going to continue talking and hating each other and whatever. So can we, for a moment, just bring down all these divisions and remember that we are brothers, we are one humanity, we are one big happy family for peace, love and harmony. For peace, love and harmony. We are one big happy family for peace, love, happiness, and joy and harmony. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Ambassador of Kiribati for his very spirited intervention. I see no further requests for the floor, and I think that was probably a very fitting way to end this agenda item. Section 3 of the working paper, TPNW MSB/22 working paper 7, contains a possible decision for adoption by the meeting, but the contents of that decision have been taken up in the working paper on the intersessional process and in the action plan. So we'll not take any action on this now, but when we take actions on those papers. May I take it that it's the wish of the meeting to conclude the consideration of sub-item B of agenda item 11? Thank you. The meeting will now consider sub-item C, entitled Deadlines for the Removal of Operational Status and Destruction of Nuclear Weapons and Other Nuclear Weapons Explosive Devices and their Removal from National Territories, Article 4. On agenda item 11, entitled Consideration of the Status and Operation of the Treaty and Other Matters Important for Achieving the Objectives and purpose of the treaty. I would like to inform delegations that an advanced unedited version of Working Paper TPNW/MSP/22/Working Paper 9, entitled Deadlines for the Removal from Operational Status and Destruction of Nuclear Weapons and Other Nuclear Explosive Devices and their Removal from National Territories, brackets Article 4, brackets, was made available on the meeting website this morning. We will now hear a presentation from Mr. Martinus van Schalkwyk from South Africa, and South Africa has facilitated very ably the consultation process over the past months on this topic. South Africa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. And South Africa was honored to assist in facilitating the discussion on Article 4 deadlines for the removal from operational status and destruction of nuclear weapons and other nuclear explosive devices, and the removal from national territories. The importance of this provision cannot be overemphasized. A firm destruction deadline avoids an open-ended disarmament process, which is the bane of other instruments dealing with nuclear disarmament. This is one of the decisions that has to be taken during the current meeting of states parties, as stipulated by the treaty, in view of the implications it would have for states that join and have Article 4.2 and Article 4.4 obligations. It was therefore important to take into consideration as many views and technical advice as possible, and within the short informal consultation period after the entry into force of the treaty. Mr. President, following these consultations, the following proposal emerged with respect to deadlines on Article 4.2 and Article 4.4. On destruction deadline, it is proposed that state parties adopt a maximum upper limit of 10 years as the deadline required for nuclear weapon destruction in accordance with a legally binding time-bound plan. As in other disarmament treaties with weapon destruction deadlines, it is further proposed that the states parties also provide for the possibility of an extension request and agree to establish a maximum extension period of up to 5 years on an exceptional basis. The specific requirements of extension requests could be elaborated upon by a future meeting of states parties or a review conference of the treaty. With regard to deadlines for the removal of nuclear weapons from nuclear weapon hosting states, a deadline of up to a maximum period of 90 days is recommended. Mr. President, South Africa once again wishes to thank the states parties, international institutions, academics, and experts that provided inputs for this decision. While nuclear-armed states or nuclear hosting states did not participate, we were alive to the realities that such states would face in order to meet their obligations once they were parties to the treaty. We therefore present this decision to the meeting of states parties, and we'd like to thank you for the opportunity and also for all the participation that we received from the states parties during the process leading up to this. Thank you again, Mr. President.
I would like to thank the delegation of South Africa for this intervention, and on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for the process of facilitating this important decision over the past few months. We have received requests from the floor from 3 delegations, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Cuba. So let me start by giving the floor to the delegation of the Philippines, please.
President, the Philippines thanks South Africa for lending its expertise on this subject. We salute South Africa's unprecedented and commendable act of unilaterally, publicly, and permanently giving up its nuclear weapons program. The deadlines that will be set by the meeting of states parties should be based on technical feasibility, taking into account scientific advice and historical precedents. The deadline should also take into consideration stockpile sizes, as well as the varying logistical complexity in disarming them. The deadlines that we set must be realistic and practical, yet credible, embodying the sense of urgency to dismantle, so that they are not used as an excuse by nuclear weapon states and those under their security umbrella to reject the treaty. Thank you very much.
I thank the delegation of the Philippines and now give the floor to the delegation of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor under this agenda item. First of all, I would like to commend South Africa for their excellent work in facilitating and preparing this working paper. I would also like to thank them for their presentation, which is certainly very useful to help us address our topic of discussion. My delegation shares the understanding that the elimination of nuclear weapons is a very complex process, not to mention that the number of arsenals possessed by nuclear-armed states is also varied. In this regard, setting up an absolute maximum yet appropriate deadline would be more convenient. Drawing examples from other disarmament treaties, we support a 10-year deadline as presented in the working paper as a reasonable and a welcome proposal. We also support the idea of a possible extension of deadlines to give room for an exceptional circumstances in the future process. We believe that many countries, including Indonesia, have a very limited knowledge to be able to divine when a nuclear weapon has been considered irreversibly eliminated. Therefore, experiences from countries that have gone through this process before, as well as advices from experts and scientific center, would be very instrumental in this matter. In conclusion, Indonesia supports the working paper and all necessary measures to achieve the goal of this treaty. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Indonesia, and I now give the floor to Cuba, to be followed by Ecuador. Cuba, please, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Thank you, President. President, we welcome the excellent work carried out by South Africa as a facilitator of this working document on deadlines for the removal of nuclear weapons. Cuba supports a period of 90 days to ensure secure transfer. We would like to reiterate that these deadlines, whose relevance and duration should be agreed upon in a meeting of states parties, should be motivated by exceptional circumstances and be explained by the relevant states. Finally, for Cuba, it's essential that the requirements for requests to extend deadlines are approved in future meetings of states parties or in a conference of this treaty. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Cuba and now give the floor to the delegation of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. With regard to deadlines, under Article 4 of the treaty about the complete elimination of nuclear weapons, we'd like to recognise the constructive role of the facilitators and the particular support of civil society and academia, whose participation has helped the preparatory process for states to base their discussions on scientific basis and the need to find a balance that ensures the treaty is applicable. We'd like to express our support for the actions reflected in the action plan and offer our continued support for any future discussions. We would also like to support setting deadlines for the final documents, which should reflect 10 years with a possibility for extension and 90 days for removing these weapons from the territory. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Ecuador and I now give the floor to Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. First of all, we'd like to thank the South African delegation for their facilitation and also the broad consultations that they carried out on this topic. We are pleased that the deadlines suggested to comply with the provisions of Article 4, in particular the 10-year period when it comes to destroying artefacts of nuclear explosions and 90 days for removing it from areas in national territory or jurisdiction, respectively, are backed up with factual information, prior experience, and scientific analysis. Also, we believe that we need to think about any potential reasons for extending these deadlines and to ensure that any requests for extensions are duly justified and approved by states parties to this treaty. We also obviously think that this should be based on technical consideration, all of that activity, that is to say, when it comes to deadlines. And we need to involve all agencies and organisations that have the skills to help us with this. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Mexico. I now turn to the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, civil society friends and colleagues. I am trained as a physicist and work as a disarmament scientist at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy and as part of the program on science and global security at Princeton University. Together with my colleague Zia Mian, we have studied the issues of deadlines and published our analysis in academic journals. After this session, I will be happy to provide the articles to anyone who is interested. Let me turn to the deadline for nuclear-armed states. So in nuclear-armed states, weapon dismantlement, in fact, is common practice for weapon maintenance and modernization. And so the infrastructure for nuclear weapon dismantlement already exists. The facilities used for weapon manufacturing and assembly are already used for weapon dismantlement. So nuclear-armed states joining the TPNW could immediately start the process of dismantlement. So since 1945, since the first weapon exploded, nuclear-armed states have dismantled an estimated 110,000 nuclear weapons. This corresponds to a global average rate of nearly 1,500 dismantlements every year. And so at this rate, the current global stockpile of about 13,000 nuclear weapons could be destroyed in less than a decade. Our research actually included a more detailed analysis of the dismantlement history of individual states, and it suggests a similar result. So the weapon destruction for each of these 9 nuclear weapon states is possible in less than 10 years. The actual times could be even less because as soon as states stop to have nuclear weapons, the additional dismantlement capacity becomes available when they stop doing maintenance and modernization. So my first recommendation related to Article 4.2 would be a deadline of 10 years for the weapon destruction could be applied to each nuclear-armed state. As nuclear-armed states only have single or at most 2 facilities for weapon dismantlement, unexpected events such as a serious accident during dismantlement could upset this planned schedule for the destruction process. Hence, it seems states may have to seek for an extension for the deadline for nuclear weapon destruction and modification of the time-bound plan for elimination of their weapon programs. Such a request for extension would need a detailed explanation to explain the exceptional difficulties and how they would be overcome. Any such request would have to be approved by the TPNW member states. Before closing, let me briefly turn to the deadline for nuclear hosting states. So the removal of weapons from hosting states is common practice by nuclear-armed states. In our research, we studied past cases of United States and Soviet weapon removal from Cuba, the former German Democratic Republic, Taiwan, Hungary, the Republic of Korea, and Greece. In all these cases, after the decision was taken, the time to fully remove nuclear weapons was less than 90 days. It is known that the weapons currently stationed abroad are regularly returned to the possessor state for maintenance and modernization. This means that the infrastructure for removal is available, and this infrastructure includes, for example, special aircraft and train crews and ready safety regulations. So my recommendation regarding Article 4.4 would be a deadline of 90 days, which should be feasible for each of the current nuclear weapon hosting states. I don't foresee any large problems that would require the provision for an extension for this article. And so in conclusion, the TPNW states very clearly that the actions prescribed in both articles are of highest priority. So the weapon removal should be prompt, and the destruction of weapons should be done as soon as possible. And therefore, the proposed deadlines should only be seen really as the upper limits. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy, and I now give the floor to ICANN.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I would like to thank you for giving me this floor. Article 4 of the TPNW creates a pathway for nuclear-armed states and host countries to join the treaty. ICANN urges TPNW state parties to highlight in their outreach that treaty requires nuclear-armed states immediate removals, their nuclear weapons from operational status, and destroy them as soon as possible. We all need to emphasize that concrete actions on nuclear disarmament are an urgent issue and must be seen by all as a priority today and once a nuclear state decides to disarm. On the issue of deadlines to destroy nuclear weapons and removal from them from host states, ICANN welcomes the scientific inputs and study of the issue thus far, particularly taking into account historical precedents and weapon states' capabilities for dismantling weapons today. Recognizing that the arsenals of nuclear-armed states vary substantially and that the time for verifying destructions will vary, ICANN recommends that state parties set a deadline of 10 years for the destructions of nuclear weapons, with the possibility of extension as proposed by experts. An extension should only be granted upon request to allow an unexpected difficulties and should not be awarded for any other reason. For this reason, we welcome the action in the draft Vienna Action Plan to recommend that in the intersessional period, states parties elaborate on specific requirements of extension required related to Article 4 of the treaty. ICANN urges TPNW state parties to highlight that TPNW requires any state that is hosting nuclear weapons at the time of entry into force to ensure the proper removal of such weapons as soon as possible. Removal should be seen by all as an urgent priority. ICANN supports the recommendation that states set a deadline of 90 days of such removal. ICANN urges TPNW state parties to call on nuclear weapon hosting states that joins and meet these weapon removal obligations to include in the declaration to be submitted to the Secretary General of the United Nations the complete history of hosting nuclear weapons on their territory. In conclusion, ICANN recommends that the TPNW member states discourage non-member states from starting new nuclear sharing arrangements. I thank you.
I would like to thank the representative of ICANN. We have no further requests for the floor. I give the floor to Pugwash, please.
Sorry, this position has nothing to do with Maldives, even though they are very nice place. But I'm sitting here just so I can talk. I think that just having some argument which is a little bit on the side, but it's very important. I think that in this very moment, it's okay? What do you want me to do?
Excuse me, please. That is unfortunately not possible that you take the floor from the seat of
Okay.
Malta.
Just tell me what I should do.
I'm extremely sorry, but I didn't realize that you wanted to speak. You should have inscribed in the speakers list before. We have to, unfortunately, close this item now. I'm very sorry about that. Thank you. I should inform delegations that an advanced, unedited... No, sorry, I've already said that. Delegations, dear colleagues, in light of the decisions taken throughout the informal consultations, it is my understanding that states parties wish to adopt the following decision, which should be put up on the screen. And I will read it. In the pursuit of the full and effective implementation of Article 4.2 and 4.4 of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, states parties decide: A, to adopt a maximum upper limit of 10 years as the deadline required for nuclear weapons destruction, in accordance with a legally binding time-bound plan for the verified and irreversible elimination of that states party's nuclear weapons program, including the elimination of irreversible conversion of all nuclear weapons-related facilities pursuing to Article 4.2. B, to establish a maximum extension period of up to 5 years for the destruction of nuclear weapons. C, that an extension request may be granted by a meeting of states parties or a review conference on an exceptional basis to overcome unexpected difficulties in the disarmament process. D, that the extension request must not exceed the number of years strictly necessary for that state party to complete its obligations under Article 4.2, and the states party must stay within the maximum extension period. E, that such requests should contain 1, the duration of the proposed extension, 2, the detailed explanation of the reasons for the proposed extension, including a description of the challenges met in fulfillment of the original plan. 3, an updated and detailed plan for destruction that specifically includes measures to address the challenges met in fulfilling the original plan. F, that the specific requirements for extension requests could be elaborated upon a future meeting of states parties or review conference of the treaty based on advice of the Scientific Advisory Group and information from relevant technical agencies. G, that any decision on the above by states parties should be informed by the recommendations of the Scientific Advisory Group and relevant international technical agencies. H, to adopt a deadline of up to a maximum period of 90 days for the removal of nuclear weapons from hosting states. May I take it that's the wish of the meeting to adopt the decision just proposed? It is so decided. I would like to thank all of you for taking this important decision. It was pointed out by South Africa in its introduction. This is the one decision that the negotiations themselves tasked the first meeting of states parties to take. I would like to thank again the facilitator, South Africa, for preparing this decision, and for all delegations for the constructive and inclusive cooperation in getting to this decision. We've just taken a very important step. May I take it it's the wish of the meeting to conclude its consideration of sub-item C of agenda item 11? It is so decided. I will now hand over the chair to my Vice President, Ambassador Campuzano Piña of Mexico.
Good afternoon. The meeting will now consider sub-item D, entitled Competent International Authority, including verification, Article 4 of the agenda, item 11, entitled Consideration of the Status and Operation of the Treaty and other matters important for achieving the objectives and purpose of the treaty. Delegations have before them working paper TPNW/MSP/2022/WP1 entitled Designation of a Competent International Authorities, submitted by the co-facilitators Brazil and Mexico following consultations with state parties. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico, Alonso Martinez, who will present on behalf of the co-facilitators the result of their consultation process on the competent international authority, including verification. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor vicepresidente.
Thank you very much, Vice President. The delegations from Mexico and Brazil were co-facilitators for this document on establishing a competent international authority and national authority. And I would like to personally thank Ambassador Flavio D'Anico, Claudio Leopoldino, and in particular my colleague Leonardo Cardocchi from the Brazilian delegation for the huge amount of work and effort put into this document. For considering this document, we had 3 open consultations, as well as a large number of bilateral meetings with states parties, civil society and academia. We're grateful for the great amount of interest shown. This constructive dialogue allowed us to incorporate different points of view, and so we believe that the final product, this document, is fruit of a collective effort. The initial document was a survey to try to understand the different positions, concerns of the different delegations and how we could move forward with the topic. And then we worked on 2 revised documents which we put forward for open consultations to receive proposals or comments in writing. We're grateful for the active participation from a large number of states parties and other relevant stakeholders. I'm aware that we have a limited amount of time to make progress in our work in this meeting, so I'd like to highlight a few key elements we identified throughout the process. Recognising the importance of Article 4 along with Articles 1, 8 and 12 as an important precept for establishing the TPNW as a disarmament instrument as part of the larger disarmament architecture. Naming a competent international or national authority was provided for by those who drafted the document as a substantive element that should be carried out in a careful and holistic way through scientific and technical considerations. While Article 4 identified its function as a negotiating and reporting organ, as well as identification, we wanted to leave it open to work out the specific nature of how these tasks would be carried out. This provides flexibility to decide how to make these general obligations operational. And so the working document works incrementally, looking at transparency, participation, legitimacy and efficacy. We look at the institutionalization of disarmament treaties without these undermining this regime. Article 4.6 of the treaty, in this meeting of states parties, in the initial stage, we had time to think about developing a negotiation and verification mechanisms with contributions made by states parties as well as scientific and technical contributions, especially for states that may not have, for which the treaty has not entered into force. We made specific recommendations for an intersessional process that will do a detailed analysis of what it means to designate competent national and international authorities. For example, whether we would need to set up a new agency or whether we could use the verification skills that already exist, or a hybrid model. We also talked about how we would understand the purposes of each of the different reporting verification models to ensure that these are fully complied with, which means interactions between different mandates, as well as fully understanding what is implied by the broader mandate of the TPNW when it comes to nuclear weapons programs. In the document, we made a few specific recommendations which feed into the action plan. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Alonso Martinez for his presentation on behalf of the co-facilitators. I will now open the floor, and I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Philippines. Philippines, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Article 4 gives practical grounding for the goals of the TPNW. In this context, we welcome the working paper submitted by Brazil and Mexico that unpacks decision points states parties must take on designating a competent international authority. We agree with the proposal to take an incremental approach that is grounded in current geopolitical realities. Such an approach should take into account the principles of transparency and inclusivity. The work of the competent international authority must be conducted with utmost professionalism, independence, and impartiality, based on a scientific and technical mandate to keep at bay any external political influence. We support the recommendation to establish an informal working group that will discuss the development of a coherent approach to all matters related to a competent international authority and identify specific technical aspects of verification for which inputs from the scientific advisory group are essential. The intersessional period may provide further opportunity to advance these discussions. We further support the participation of all states parties and stakeholders, including UNIDIR, ICRC, and civil society organizations in the informal working group. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice Chair, at the outset, allow me to thank the co-facilitators, Brazil and Mexico, to the hard work in preparing the working paper. Article 4 is integral to the treaty's objective of achieving a world free of nuclear weapons. Malaysia is of the view that a carefully considered, deliberate, and incremental approach that most importantly is informed by latest developments in science and technology would need to be taken in establishing the competent international authority for the TPNW. This would provide the authority with the requisite mandate to carry out its work in a manner that preserves its credibility as well as the integrity of the treaty. We are fortunate as others have trodden similarly difficult paths. Indeed, we can learn and draw lessons from the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention. However, in doing so, we have to carefully take into account the particularities of each regime. Further, the process should be inclusive and transparent to ensure that the authority will receive the full and broad support of states parties. My delegation wishes to assure you of our full support and readiness to engage in this process with a view to realizing its objectives. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia for her words. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to thank the co-facilitators, Brazil and Mexico, for the paper capturing the discussions held during our informal session. Mr. President, there has already been criticism of a so-called lack of a verification mechanism for the treaty, and therefore any such instrument or structure that is being developed will be subjected to scrutiny and should stand up to the highest standards of inquiry. However, Mr. President, we need to bear in mind that some structures already exist, and consideration should be maintained to rely on these structures as a first option, with addition of aspects that might be needed in the TPNW context. In essence, we do not need to start from scratch when considering these issues. We propose that the president of a meeting of states parties or the informal facilitator that the meeting of states parties is considering to appoint to further explore and articulate possible areas for tangible cooperation between the TPNW and NPT also be mandated to keep discussions with the IAEA open in view of their significant contribution to verification. Given that there is no rush to take a decision and that this aspect will need to be extremely accurate, we should follow a methodical approach in moving forward on the matter. The competent international authority or authorities will have particular negotiation and verification mandates. We note that the decision on the deadlines with respect to Article 4.2 and 4.4 will be taken has been taken already at this current meeting. However, we also have to factor the issue of the competent international authority into our reasoning when looking at the deadlines issue and the CIA and the competent international authority mandate, given that they will have to work together and be mutually reinforcing. The mandate provided by states parties needs to be flexible so as to encourage comprehensive discussion and analysis of the issue and to respond or adapt to new information, advice, or technical guidance received during the intersessional period. In South Africa's view, the working group should be a state party driven with input from non-state entities when requested by the working group. While we note that we have already lost 6 months of the second meeting of states parties preparatory period, it is our proposal that states parties be given 90 days after this meeting to nominate a contact point to deal with the comprehensive, with the CIA. This is in view of the congested disarmament calendar and most states having limited capacity on disarmament issues, which makes it difficult to engage national stakeholders and securing the necessary authorization of nominated officials. We hope that these concerns will be taken into consideration as we set up the mandate for this working group. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa for his declaration, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba. Cuba, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, President. I'd like to begin by expressing the satisfaction that Cuba feels at seeing a delegate from Mexico presiding over this meeting. President, first of all, we'd like to thank Mexico and Brazil for the work that they've carried out as facilitators of this working document on incompetent national authorities for the TPNW. In the opinion of the Cuban delegation, this is probably the most difficult and complex topic, and states parties will probably need to make a decision about this complex topic in the future. Although this first meeting of states parties is under no obligation under the treaty to make a decision about this competent national authority. What we do need to do is start working about the parameters under which we're going to select this national authority in the future, or establish this national authority. Cuba supports a step-by-step gradual approach for establishing this authority without putting ourselves under any unnecessary time pressure. However, clearly we can't stretch this process out into the future indefinitely, because that would weaken the treaty's credibility. We now find ourselves in the first phase of implementation of the TPNW. And obviously we do have time on our side and enough time available to us to think about this issue. However, that window of opportunity will reduce over time. Cuba believes that we need to be ready for the point at which the treaty enters into force, so that Articles 4.1 and 4.2 of the treaty are able to be applied. We support the idea of setting up a working group in charge of leading and carrying out this work, this preparatory work in the international period for designating a competent national authority. This preparatory work should include the drawing up of recommendations about the structure, mandate, specific functions, and financial implications of this international authority. In order that states parties can have as much information as possible available to them at the point in time at which we need to make a decision on this important topic, we think it would be a good idea for the working group to present to us, the states parties, for consideration the advantages and disadvantages of various options. For example, Cuba would really like to have clear information about the advantages and the disadvantages of having one or more than one national authority, as well as the pros and cons of designating an already existing structure as a national authority, or, on the other hand, setting up a new structure that is specifically there from the very beginning to comply with the requirements of this treaty. We also believe it would be useful to have information or a clear list of the pros and cons of a hybrid model as a third option. In principle, we feel more in favour of designating one competent national authority rather than various. We think that this would simplify the process and help to achieve greater effectiveness. This authority obviously would have to be able to negotiate and also have the capacity to report, but it's also very important that they would also have the capacity to act as a verification mechanism. That's very important because, as you all know, one of the most frequent criticisms levied at the treaty by nuclear states or by members of NATO is that this treaty is not verifiable. And what we need to demonstrate in practice is that this allegation is in fact false. We would also be tempted to designate a pre-existing organisation as the authority rather than creating a completely new one. However, President, I'd like to make it very clear that the Cuban delegation is open to considering different options and that we'll make a definitive decision on this topic once we have more information about it. What I would like to say is that I think we need to be very careful when it comes to adopting this decision as a result of the important consequences that will have in terms of our credibility and effectiveness under this treaty. Finally, we believe that, like in other documents that recommend the setting up of working groups, in this case, the recommendation on this topic should reflect who will participate in this working group, obviously, as well as interested parties. Cuba is aware of the particular complexity and sensitivity of this issue, and given that, we think it would be a good idea to open up the option for participation in this group from any member states or other relevant stakeholders that states believe it would be a good idea to invite to participate in the activities of this working group. Thank you, President.
Muchas gracias al distinguido delegado.
Many thanks to the distinguished delegate from Cuba, and thank you very much as well for your initial words.
I give the floor to Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Zimbabwe. Wilf, Zimbabwe, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, thank you to the Chair for giving me the floor to speak about Article 4 of the TPNW, specifically competent international authority including verification. We are pleased that the TPNW is the first and only multilateral mechanism that provides for and requires verification of nuclear disarmament, and look forward to the further discussion on this important component of nuclear disarmament. In particular, we recommend that states parties pursue further discussions during the intersectional period towards developing a coherent approach on a competent international authority or authorities, from the general obligations to specific mandates and guidance for the designation of international authorities. We also recommend that states draw on the work already done by scientific and other experts on the organization of the competent international authority in these discussions. We recommend that states take into consideration the experience from regional organizations involved in verification of nuclear weapons-related issues, including the organization of the nuclear weapons-free zones and regional organizations in areas present in the TPNW. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much to the distinguished representative of WILP Zimbabwe. Now I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pugwash. You have the floor.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. I would like to make quick comments about the point of towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons, which is your point 4. I think there are some dangers in this very moment about the lack of progress in the elimination of nuclear weapons. I want to remind the distinguished participant to this meeting that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was signed by Iran and by the other important countries possessing nuclear weapons, has been killed, and there is no confirmation that this will be restored. So I urge the participants to this distinguished conference to make their own efforts by diplomacy to reinstate the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I also would like to say that there is a big problem of countries that possess nuclear weapons which do not belong to them. There are 5 countries in Europe that are possessing nuclear weapons. This is Italy, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, and Turkey. They host American nuclear weapons, and I think it would be very important if this country will be induced to remove from their own territory nuclear weapons that belong to other countries. And I think that there is only 100 nuclear weapons present in European countries. They are all Americans. And the presence of these nuclear weapons essentially is a symbolic, important point which goes in exactly direct opposition to what is discussed in this conference. Finally, unfortunately, the Ukrainian war is dangerous on many sides. I think that we have to remember that this is the biggest crisis after the Cuban Missile Crisis that involves countries possessing nuclear weapons. And the distinguished participants to this conference should make all efforts to convince the countries that are involved in this war to restrain, to avoid even thinking about nuclear deterrence, as someone was mentioning recently, as an element that could be included into the resolution of this conference. We are running serious risks, and I think that this country, the country of this conference, which have done so much in order to prevent the nuclear risk, should do their best in order to avoid nuclear conflicts. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to the distinguished representative of Pilgrims. I see no further requests for the floor. Section 7 of the working paper TPNW MSP/2022 working paper 1 contains draft decisions, recommendations, and actions. The contents of that section have been taken up in the working paper on the intersessional process and in the draft Vienna Action Plan. May I take it, it's the wish of the meeting to conclude its consideration of sub-item D of the agenda item 11. It's so decided. Now we pass to the meeting will now consider sub-item E entitled Victim Assistance, Environmental Remediation and International Cooperation and Assistance, Article 6 and 7 of the agenda item 11 entitled Consideration of the Status and Operation of the Treaty and other matters important for achieving the objectives and purpose of the Treaty. Delegations have before them working paper TPNW/MSP/2022/WP5 entitled Implementing Articles 6 and 7, submitted by the co-facilitators Kazakhstan and Kiribati, following consultations with state parties. I now give the floor to Ms. Sangeldi Sirambet, who will present on behalf of the co-facilitators the result of their consultation process on victim assistance, environmental remediation, and international cooperation and assistance. Mr. Sirambet, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Kazakhstan and Kiribati, I'd like to thank the President for giving us an opportunity to present our working paper and draft decisions of the first meeting of states parties to the TPNW. At the outset, I'd like to thank our distinguished colleagues, Ambassador Tito of Kiribati and their team, Christian Chobano and Bonnie Doherty, for for their hard work and all the efforts towards the preparation of these decisions. Kazakhstan and Kiribati proposed recommendations for the portions of the outcome document of the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, dealing with Articles 6 and 7 on victim assistance, environmental remediation, and international cooperation and assistance. The paper and draft decisions are the result of a series of consultations with states parties, international organizations, and civil society on the implementation of these positive obligations. Kazakhstan and Kiribati organized those consultations at the request of the President-designate of the first meeting of states parties. We commend all the states parties, ICRC, ICANN, and civil society for providing their valuable inputs. Special thanks go to our esteemed colleagues from New Zealand for their valuable recommendations and important support. Given the time limits for the presentation, I'd like to point out specific areas where we stressed our focus, stressed our attention. In their oral and written contributions to that process, states, international organizations, and civil society groups offered input on the steps that should be taken at the first meeting of states parties with regard to victim assistance, international remediation, and international cooperation and assistance. Their comments centered on the following 6 areas around which the working paper has been structured: commitment to implementation, establishment of an implementation framework, reporting on implementation measures, intersessional work, international trust fund for affected states, commitment to inclusivity. Mr. President, I'm pleased to express our readiness to continue our work as co-facilitators for the next intersessional period, and I'd like to thank all the delegations, civil society, and all interested experts for their support and their help in preparing these draft decisions. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Sirimbet for his presentation on behalf of the facilitators, Kazakhstan and Kiribati. And now I open the floor for the participation of delegations. I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Philippines. Philippines, you have the floor.
Mr. President, the core principles of Philippine engagement in humanitarian disarmament, including in the context of nuclear weapons, are 1. Centrality of victims in all humanitarian disarmament work, and 2. The importance of building independent national capacities. In the aftermath of a nuclear detonation, recovery of affected victims and their livelihoods, reconstruction of infrastructure, regeneration of economic activities, and remediation of the environment would be a protracted and painful undertaking for humanity, if any survive at all. Radiation exposure could result in long-term health effects and future hereditary pathologies. Women and vulnerable groups are especially and disproportionately affected given socioeconomic and socio-political structures that render them especially susceptible. The Philippines welcomes the readiness of states affected by nuclear tests to fulfill their TPNW obligations, including the development of their own national plans. However, we stress that the onus to undertake victim assistance should not fall on the affected states, who are the very victims of this humanitarian impact. The international community should help them develop and implement their national plans and facilitate the necessary international cooperation and assistance. We therefore welcome and support the working paper of Kazakhstan and Kiribati on implementing Articles 6 and 7. We support constructive dialogue on the 6 areas identified in the working paper, namely commitment to implementation, establishment of an implementation framework, reporting on the implementation process, intersessional work, establishing an international trust fund for affected states, and commitment to inclusivity. In this vein, we wish to make the following initial practical inputs. First, the proposed mechanisms to discuss the institutionalization of the implementation of Articles 6 and 7 should have the facility to ensure the inclusion of small island developing states in the Pacific. Second, institutions like UNODA could be given the mandate to create and maintain a global registry of national action plans and reports on action taken with regard to victim assistance and environmental remediation, and to undertake a comprehensive analysis of these submissions with a view to identifying gaps and needs. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Philippines for her declaration, and now I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia. Malaysia, you have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, my delegation takes this opportunity to thank both the co-facilitator, Kazakhstan and Kiribati, for their excellent efforts in finalizing the working paper. Mr. President, the TPNW was born from the shared deep concern on the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that would result from any use of nuclear weapons. The TPNW further recognizes that these catastrophic humanitarian consequences transcend national borders and pose grave implications to humanity. Taking this in context, Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty represent the heart of the TPNW, which provide the first international framework for addressing the ongoing humanitarian, human rights, and environmental consequences of the past use and testing of nuclear weapons. Fully recognizing the importance of operationalizing these articles, my delegation is heartened that the intersessional period will include furthering the substantive discussions in the areas of victim assistance, environmental remediation, and international cooperation and assistance. On this matter, my delegation wishes to highlight 2 points. First, efforts in assisting victims and undertaking environmental remediation should take into account data and information backed by science, not only on the impact of the use of nuclear weapons, but also, importantly, on how assistance and remediation can most effectively and efficiently be rendered. As we have seen, information backed by data and science shows that the consequences may be different for men and women in terms of the profile and severity of harm. These findings are crucial in order for us to be better prepared in responding to and rendering effective, appropriate, and adequate support to affected victims. Further, efforts at studying such impacts, which may possibly be taken up by the Scientific Advisory Group, should be extended to ensure that the results are widely shared and distributed. In this way, not only will such studies contribute towards mitigation and remedial efforts, their results may also provide further impetus in diminishing support for the maintenance of nuclear weapons. Secondly, we note that international cooperation and assistance is understood as rendering support to states that are affected by the past use and testing of nuclear weapons. My delegation hopes that, in addition, there could be sharing of knowledge among all states parties on how to prepare for and respond to any eventuality through timely, effective, and efficient action. Finally, Mr. President, my delegation wishes to assure you of our commitment to deliberations of these issues during the international period. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia for his statement. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa. South Africa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The positive obligations of the treaty are essential to achieving its humanitarian goals. Victim assistance and environmental remediation ensure that the treaty provides a comprehensive response to the consequences of nuclear weapons use and testing. As part of the positive obligations, Article 6 and 7 of the treaty makes provision for states parties with relevant obligations under the treaty and for states parties in a position to do so to provide assistance to victims of the use of testing of nuclear weapons. This creates a legal obligation for some states parties to ensure the rights of nuclear weapons victims and is reflective of the humanitarian concerns that underpin the TPNW. In addition, there is an obligation for states parties to take the necessary and appropriate measures towards the environmental remediation of areas contaminated by nuclear weapons use or tests. Unlike the Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention, these articles bring the TPNW in line with other recently adopted disarmament treaties, such as the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention and the Convention on Cluster Munitions. We note that there is no provision in the treaty for affected states parties to report on remediation efforts, as is the case in other disarmament treaties. As regards international cooperation, it must be noted that such cooperation is crucial in terms of Articles 6 and 7, and also more broadly in the fulfillment of the rest of the TPNW's obligations. Mr. President, when considering how we reflect this important issue in the political declaration as well as the intercessional process and plan of action, it will be important not to inadvertently accord obligations to states parties that do not apply to them. Articles 6 and 7 are clear that it is states parties with victims under their jurisdiction that have an obligation, or states parties in a position to do so, to provide such assistance. We trust that the outcome documents of the meeting of states parties will not create any legal ambiguities that could negatively impact states that wish to join the treaty but have concerns related to these aspects. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. Now I'll give the floor to, le doy la palabra al distinguido representante de Cuba.
I'll now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba. You have the floor. Thank you, President. We would like to thank Kazakhstan and Kiribati for their work as facilitators for the document on assistance to victims, environmental compensation and international assistance. We would like to highlight the importance of this topic. Between 1945 and 2007, more than 2,000 explosive nuclear tests have been carried out, and the radioactive particles as a result of these tests have spread across the entire world. There is a lot that is still yet to be researched about the effects that people will have suffered from this and the consequences of different countries when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons and nuclear testing. Nuclear states have a particular responsibility, both a legal and moral responsibility, when it comes to providing victim assistance after their nuclear weapons testing. Nothing would stop a nuclear state that is not party to the TPNW to contributing to the positive commitments under this treaty when it comes to assistance and international cooperation. Assistance should include technical and financial assistance, and also technological transfer, in particular for when it comes to environmental reparation. We support the establishment of an informal working group to coordinate consultation on this topic during the intersessional period. We believe that this group should be open for all states parties to participate, as well as signatory and interested states, as well as any other stakeholders that states parties consider to be a good idea to invite. We believe that the proposed action plan reflects the commitments made under Articles 6 and 7, and we believe that these should be differentiated. Affected states and victims deserve particular support, and we should preserve the principle of the voluntary nature of the informal work. And so we suggest that we include among the recommendations that any affected state party, on the basis of the principle of responsibility, reports on their need for international assistance. It would be a good idea for this information to be presented in a single format that could be dealt with by states parties. Thank you.
Le agradezco mucho.
Thank you very much. My thanks to the distinguished representative from Cuba for her statement.
Give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cook Islands. You have the floor.
Co-Chair, the Cook Islands says Meta Kimata to the co-facilitators for their comprehensive work on this agenda item. Articles 6 and 7 bring to the nuclear disarmament and proliferation regime a human face and human heart. It allows all states, small or large, and irrespective of where your government's policies on nuclear disarmament may lie, to begin the important work for addressing the ongoing humanitarian and environmental consequences of the past use and testing of nuclear weapons. As you have heard over the past 2 days, or may have known for some time, the Pacific region was used as a testing ground for nuclear explosives between 1946 and 1996. The Cook Islands was not a testing site, but sat sandwiched between two countries that were at the time being used as test sites. That is Kiribati, who is a co-facilitator for this agenda, and French Polynesia. We lent our voice and stood together with our neighbors in protest against using our region as a nuclear testing ground. And our collective action assisted in leading to the end of these nuclear tests, the beginning of a regional approach to nuclear weapons testing, culminating in the Treaty of Rarotonga, and changes in international law. Naturally, we share the concern of all here at the ongoing humanitarian and environmental impacts of past nuclear weapons use and testing, including recognizing that the rights and needs of many affected individuals and communities have not been adequately addressed, and they have often been marginalized. We see this human aspect as an important point of difference between this treaty and others. So we, the Cook Islands, fully support the establishment of an international trust fund that will provide aid to survivors and support measures towards remediating the environment. We welcome the commitment of affected states to begin work on initial assessment and plans and to share information through which other states' parties can understand their needs. And in this connection, acknowledge the importance of Article 7, which gives these states agency to ask for assistance in these tasks. For our part, the Cook Islands will do what we can to achieve concrete and swift progress in the implementation of Articles 6 and 7. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cook Islands for her declaration. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Samoa. Samoa, you have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, we would like to firstly thank Kiribati and Kazakhstan as the co-facilitators on the Positive Obligations Working Paper and the operationalization of Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty. We have heard testimonies from survivors of nuclear tests and nuclear detonations and their struggles. We remain concerned at ongoing humanitarian and environmental impacts of nuclear weapons in our Pacific region and beyond. Survivors continue to receive little assistance to address their ongoing health, psychosocial, and socioeconomic concerns. We welcome the recommendations of the co-facilitators, including establishing an international trust fund for those who have been affected. We encourage all states, international organizations, and civil society to cooperate to assist affected states with Article 6 implementation. We particularly welcome the expression of support for victims' assistance and environmental remediation from states not yet party to this treaty. We highlight the collective, inclusive, and gender-sensitive process that centers around affected communities, and we welcome further work in the intercessional period. As small island states, we can no longer rely on our isolation as our protection. Therefore, we reiterate the chorus of calls by members to delegations who have not yet done so to join the TPNW to bring us a step closer to a nuclear, weapons-free world. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Samoa for his declaration. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kiribati. Kiribati, you have the floor.
Thank you, co-facilitator, co-chair. On the occasion of the first meeting of the states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, Kazakhstan and Kiribati, as countries humanly and environmentally impacted by nuclear testing, would like to highlight the initiative launched last year. And we thank the President-designate, Ambassador Clement and his team and many others who have encouraged us to take on this very, very huge and important responsibility. So Kazakhstan and Kiribati greatly grateful and honored and thankful for the opportunity of being provided this role. And we thank all those who have assisted us from the different states parties and also from NGOs, civil societies, and many, many others who have helped us move the process up to where we are now. So thank you again. And all the statements you make today, and including those of the previous days, these are really encouraging us to move on. And as stated by my colleague from Kazakhstan, we're ready to carry on the task. Of course, we can do it with your support, and we know we will succeed with your support. And thank you again. We devote particular attention to the treaty's positive obligations in Articles 6 and 7. These provisions are central to the humanitarian goals of the treaty and ensure that it addresses the harm from past use and testing of nuclear weapons, as well as prevents future harm. The world is currently facing the existential dangers of nuclear weapons as never before because of continuous course of nuclear-armed states in maintaining and modernizing their nuclear arsenals. We are concerned about the erosion of trust amongst the nuclear powers, which could jeopardize long-standing international agreements on nuclear weapons. And as I mentioned earlier, and I did sing about it, we should think like one family rather than being divided. And we should continue to think like that, because otherwise we would never achieve what we are trying to do, especially when the nuclear powers, the strong ones, will keep on saying, we don't believe in you, what you're doing. So thank you again for this opportunity to enable Kiribati and Kazakhstan to contribute. State parties should ensure all voices are included at this meeting and in future discussions on positive obligations to assist victims, remediate the environment, and provide international cooperation. These voices should be diverse along gender, age, race, and social-economic lines, and must also include affected communities, civil societies, youth groups, CRC, and the international organizations. It is also our strong conviction that the TPNW complements the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. Additionally, in August 2022, the long-delayed NPT review conference will be taking place in New York, where state parties should reaffirm the centrality of NPT, including the 2010 NPT Action Plan, the 13 practical steps on nuclear disarmament, and more significantly, Article 6 of the treaty, to support a rules-based international proliferation regime and support mutually enforcing international treaties. We further recommend that state parties emphasize the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, which is indeed a critical issue considering the current international situations. We trust that members of the international community will be able to breach their differences and support international measures to help establish a just and peaceful world, and thus safeguarding lives of future generations ahead. We encourage all state parties and signatories to join our work in providing justice for the victims of nuclear weapons. We further call upon state parties to sign and ratify the TPNW. As a closing from speaking for Kiribati, that was kind of a joint statement between Kazakhstan. But speaking on behalf of the Kiribati delegation, I'd like to say again that in Kiribati, of course, we believe that one day the world will come together and think united on this, that we no longer have a division of minds, the big ones and the small ones, the powerful and the weak, those who believe in weapons that can make a lot of money. We don't believe in money, we believe in humanity. Human peace, human harmony, human happiness is the way forward. We must all work for that, not work for other things, which can distract us and make us take on the wrong track to a world full of troubles, a world full of crying and sadness. We want a world like in Kiribati and the Pacific, happy people, happy, happy, happy world. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kiribati. Ahora le doy el uso de la palabra a...
I'll now give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Ecuador. Ecuador, you have the floor.
Gracias, presidente. Reconocemos...
Thank you, Chair. We recognise the humanitarian perspective of the treaty, and we would like to reiterate our concern about nuclear testing and the situation of people and communities. And so we would like to express our support for the establishment of a working group on victim assistance for the intercessional period, as well as the creation of a fund for victims. When it comes to the positive obligations under Articles 6 and 7 of the Treaty on Victim Assistance, Environmental Remediation and International Cooperation, the Ecuadorian delegation would like to recognise the work carried out by the co-facilitators in leading discussions and express Ecuador's support for the contribution of civil society. We recognise the commitment, and we would like to confirm our support for points 17 to 30 of the action plan. We would like to encourage greater synergy between the ecosystems of the NPT and the CTBT, and see that included in promotion of the universalization of the treaty. Thank you.
Le agradezco mucho.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ecuador for his statement.
To the distinguished representative of the ICRC.
Muchas gracias, señor vicepresidente. Nuclear weapons are today prohibited. Tomorrow they will be eliminated. But the harm caused by their use and testing remains. Victim assistance and environmental remediation obligations encapsulate the TPNW's people-centered approach and its nature as a humanitarian disarmament instrument. They are a testament to the importance of human security, a concept encompassing individual and collective health and well-being, but also the environment, food security and climate, and ultimately the very future of our planet and of humanity as a whole. all of which are gravely threatened by the continued existence of nuclear weapons. Effective implementation of the TPNW's positive obligations presupposes a solid understanding of their scope. This must be interpreted in light of key principles of humanitarian disarmament and in line with human rights law and international humanitarian law, notably the principles of non-discrimination, inclusivity, accessibility, and transparency. The ICRC is working on an interpretive guidance of Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty, which we hope to publish soon. We also hope that the practice of states parties will further clarify and solidify the scope and practical implications of the TPNW's positive obligations and ensure they are understood in a coherent, comprehensive, people-centric manner in order to fully achieve the treaty's object and purpose. Mr. Vice President, it's my pleasure now to pass the floor to our youth representatives from Japan.
Mr. Vice President, there is still a long way to go to effectively address the needs of people affected by nuclear weapons use and testing. The effect of nuclear weapons on survivors is a complex and serious matter. Among survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there are individuals waiting to be recognized as hibakusha even after 77 years. In addition, there are many survivors who have been hiding the fact that they are hibakusha due to fears of discrimination, stigmatization, and negative social impact not only on themselves, but also on their families. In light of these facts, adequate victim assistance should be provided based on people's needs and scientific evidence, giving due consideration to the protection of sensitive personal information and data. State parties should use the opportunity provided by this meeting to identify and share the concrete actions and the measures necessary to redress, to the maximum extent possible, the harm caused by the use and testing of nuclear weapons. In doing so, they should make use of the full protective scope of the treaty, with a view to implementing its positive obligations in a broad and holistic manner, taking into account both practices and lessons learned from the implementation of other humanitarian disarmament treaties, as well as the specificity of nuclear weapons and the harm they cause, which will dictate a differentiated approach in some cases.
Mr. Vice President, the treaty's victim assistance and the environmental remediation provision can have a real impact on the lives of many, including future generations. Nuclear weapons could potentially destroy our planet. Once our area is affected by radiation, it is close to impossible to restore it to its original state. Even a limited nuclear war could disrupt the global climate that would cut food production for many years, affecting a large number of people. We must not leave the negative legacy of nuclear weapons and the climate crisis to our future generations. For that, our collective actions, including joining forces between the environmental movement and the nuclear abolition movement, are called for. The ICRC welcomes the draft Vienna Action Plan and Action 17 to 30 therein. In our view, those strike optimal balance between ambition and realism and provide states parties with sufficient guidance while allowing the necessary flexibility to the environment needs and response and adapt the latter to emerging understandings of the scope of harm caused by nuclear weapons. They highlight the importance of cooperation not only among state parties, but also with other stakeholders, including very importantly affected communities as well as states not party to the treaty that have used or tested nuclear weapons. We strongly encourage state parties to adopt this action plan.
Cooperation and assistance relationships with other states outside the TPNW, as many others have mentioned, can also contribute significantly to the effective implementation of positive obligations. It is therefore important that states party to the TPNW and other states develop synergies, including in the context of the NPT, and explore the complementarity of the two instruments in this respect. Today, 77 years after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese Red Cross hospitals continue to treat people suffering from cancer and other radiation-incurred illnesses caused by the detonation. The ICRC, together with the broader Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, stands ready to assist states parties in implementing their positive obligations and to help achieve the treaty's humanitarian goal. Muchas gracias.
Hello. I thank a lot the distinguished representative of the ICRC as well as the representative of youth, of Japanese youth. And now I have the honor to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Association 193.
Thank you, Vice President. Ladies and gentlemen, delegates, excellencies. 193 French nuclear tests, that is 800 Hiroshima bombs or their equivalent, were launched in Polynesia between 1966 and 1996. They had serious consequences which gravely impact the families of my country. That is because each year 800 new cases of cancer and 300 cancer-related deaths happen with a population of 280,000 inhabitants. This has been going on for several decades. Many apply for compensation, but the French state tells them that they don't have proof that their cancer is due to nuclear testing. You've neither inhaled nor ingested more than 1 millisievert over a year's period. The Mururoa atoll could fall into the sea at any time, but the state tells us that it's no big deal. But this is our shared house. It is imperiled, in serious danger. This is further compounded by the tragedy of the undeniable rise in sea levels, which impacts erosion and all of the wells where more than 140 blasts were fired. This is the poisoned heritage that the French state left to the Polynesians for several generations. French colonization is the political system that led for nuclear testing in Polynesia and is responsible for crime against humanity. Decades of lies. The situation is alarming indeed. Investigations have been conducted by the researcher Sébastien Philippe and his team from Princeton. They say that just for 3 blasts, more than 115,000 people were potentially impacted. As such, so as to assist victims of nuclear testing, our association, on a voluntary basis, assists all families from the five island chains, independently of their social, political, or religious standing. Excellencies, France today is not a states party to the treaty, but in application of international humanitarian law and human rights, the Association 193 calls upon the French state to apologize to the Maui people and to provide full and comprehensive reparation for the damages that the tests cause for peoples and the environment. We appeal to the international community for scientific and financial assistance to our suffering people. We seek justice, truth, and reparation. We do so in the spirit of solidarity and peace, at the heart of the 2017 treaty, which brings us together today. Now I can, France. Vice President, ladies and gentlemen, 193 nuclear tests were carried out in my region for the greatness of France, for a reason of the state. The land which serves us and our lagoons have been poisoned. We've been poisoned. Our being, our bodies, and our genes have been poisoned by an invisible poison which continues to kill us. This is something which I can tell you from the bottom of my heart. France's greatness is something that I have inside of me since 2013, the year where I was diagnosed with leukemia. I was shocked, but it wasn't a surprise, because actually in my family, women have thyroid and breast cancer. This was what happened to me. The nuclear heritage France left my people is a lottery where the prizes are a list of radiation exposure diseases. In 1988, I won the prize of chronic leukemia. Since 2010, the French judiciary has begun handing down compensation to victims with these type of diseases, but type of assistance will stop because it's limited in time. Actually, only children born up until 31 December 1998 could be considered as potential victims. One might think thus that radioactivity, pollution, and the risk of transgenerational diseases disappeared for those born on 1st January 1999. We need the international community so as to protect our current and future generations as well as to remediate our environment. That is because 56 years after the first bomb, we, guinea pig peoples, still lack adapted medical care. Our children, women, and fathers have to seek medical assistance 18,000 kilometers away in specialized hospitals in Paris. Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty are concrete progress. I would like to acknowledge this as it is an acknowledgement of our battle. Today, dealing with humanitarian consequences is crucial. It will ensure that all victims of nuclear testing and nuclear weapons across the world can have true hope and a future. Thank you. I would like to thank the delegation of Association 193. Thank you for your statement, but also thank you for your eyewitness account of the situation in which people are living. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to the representative of International Human Rights Clinic, Harvard Law School. You have the floor.
Thank you. I'm reading this statement on behalf of Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic, Article 36, ICANN France, No Nukes Tokyo, the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, PACES Universities, International Anti-Disarmament Institute, and UNA UK. Humanitarian and environmental concerns lie at the heart of the TPNW. To this end, it includes not only prohibitions to prevent the devastating consequences of nuclear weapons, but positive obligations to mitigate the ongoing harm of past use and testing. It follows the lead of its humanitarian disarmament predecessors, the Convention on Cluster Munitions and the Mine Ban Treaty, and adapts them for the first time to the context of nuclear weapons. The treaty's obligations in this area are strong. Article 6.1 requires states parties to provide a range of assistance to victims. Article 6.2 requires states parties to take, quote, necessary and appropriate measures toward environmental remediation of contaminated areas. Article 6 places primary responsibility on affected states parties for practical and legal reasons, but Article 7 ensures they are supported in their efforts. These articles open doors to new forms of assistance, but they do not close doors. They do not prevent affected states or individuals from pursuing other forms of redress, including compensation from nuclear testing states. While the positive obligations of the TPNW are strong, they will only be as effective as their implementation. That process begins this week. The first meeting of states party both sets priorities for the treaty and lays the foundation for operationalizing it in the years to come. The recommendations presented in the working paper by Kazakhstan and Kiribati are an excellent starting point. We now encourage states parties to ensure to commit to them in the Vienna Action Plan. Four categories of immediate action are particularly critical. First, states parties should establish an architecture for implementation, taking initial steps between now and the 2 MSP. They should assess the needs of victims and nuclear weapons in their territory and their capacity to respond. They should adopt a national plan with budget and timeline. They should appoint a focal point and adopt relevant laws and policies. Non-affected states parties should establish mechanisms to facilitate international cooperation and assistance. And states parties should also commit to uphold the principles of accessibility, inclusivity, non-discrimination, and transparency at all stages of implementation. Second, states parties should commit to developing a voluntary reporting format. Reporting, while not required by the TPNW, facilitates monitoring, accountability, and international assistance. It need not be a burdensome process because the format can draw on models from other disarmament treaties. Third, states parties should create an informal intersessional working group on the positive obligations. The working group can provide a forum for reporting on progress, facilitating international cooperation assistance, developing international trust fund, and wrestling with complex issues related to victim assistance and environmental remediation. Fourth, states parties should commit to inclusivity at all stages of these processes. They should closely consult with and actively involve affected communities and engage all relevant stakeholders, including civil society, international organizations, indigenous people, and youth. These are manageable steps and can be achieved through collective action, and we are ready to support states with their work in this area however we can. While initiating implementation at the 1 MSP and the intersessional period is crucial, victim assistance and environmental remediation are long-term processes that will unfold over decades. Therefore, states must also look ahead. For a model, they can look to the principles for implementing victim assistance and environmental remediation over time, developed by Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic and the Conflict and Environment Observatory. In conclusion, while the grave consequences of nuclear weapons make victim assistance and environmental remediation daunting, the treaty text, the 1 MSP documents, and resources from civil society and other experts show that the positive obligations can be implemented in an effective and feasible way. Doing so is a humanitarian and environmental imperative. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank the distinguished representative of International Human Rights Clinic, as well as all the other organizations included in this statement. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peace Boat. You have the floor.
Thank you. I would like to recognize those with first-hand experience of nuclear impacts whose appeal realized the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and acknowledge those impacted persons and survivors, including those here in Vienna, here in spirit, and those who are no longer with us. Survivors tell us that harms to health, livelihood, culture, and environment are not a problem of the past. They are long-lasting. Health impacts are felt now, and the trauma passes between generations. Our statement consists of messages from a coalition of civil society organizations, and a full version will be made available online. Humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons are an ongoing generational struggle. Survivors tell us not only of the physical impacts, but also the social and the psychological. Nagasaki Hibakusha, Kido Suechi, tells of the torment of not being able to help suffering people in the wake of the bombing and lifelong fear of the ticking time bomb. In the Marshall Islands, secondary illnesses arise because of denied access to traditional lands and knowledge. Kokoro woman and third-generation survivor of British nuclear tests in Australia, Mia Hasseldine, spoke this week of post-traumatic stress following the death of her unborn daughter, who developed tumour-shaped growths and tumours in utero. States parties must address multi-generational impacts and a broad understanding of ongoing nuclear harm. Existing national assistance programs are insufficient. We call for thorough surveys of legal and health systems and for exclusionary structural inadequacies to be addressed in a broadened framework guided by a truly survivor-led approach within a broader definition of survivors as determined by survivors themselves and recognizing the impacts on populations at large. Given the history of deceit from governments and the embedded structure of nuclear colonialism and racial discrimination, we emphasise the need for more research and data made available to survivors in culturally appropriate and accessible ways, including translation into languages spoken by members of impacted communities. We stress the necessity of education and awareness raising about the history and legacy of nuclear weapons, keeping the stories of previous generations alive and including them within school curricula. Implementation of Articles 6 and 7 should occur within a framework of solidarity with not only affected states, but all states parties and those outside the treaty. It should be practical and immediate, with regular reporting and the participation of civil society, including victims themselves. We recommend states parties establish a permanent body for information and seek to establish an international trust fund. We call on states parties to affirm that affected individuals must be at the centre of discussions, including all those who self-identify as nuclear victims, and to seek input from all relevant stakeholders. States parties should engage in assistance with no one left behind. We encourage representatives to visit Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and other nuclear-affected communities, to engage in dialogue and conduct site visits to understand nuclear harm and provide the assistance sought by victims themselves. And we call on all governments to join the treaty as a step toward providing better support and services for survivors around the globe and ensuring that their utmost wish is realised to prevent anyone else from suffering as they have. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Peace Boat, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thanks for giving us the floor. First, we would like to thank the co-facilitators for all their work. Given the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons, the positive obligations in Articles 6 and 7 are extremely important. This was underlined once more by the survivors' testimonies and the scientific data presented in recent days. As an observer state to the TPNW, Switzerland commends the efforts to translate the obligations into action and to put in place effective structures to identify needs, to raise resources, and to address the humanitarian harm with concrete work on the ground. Given the magnitude of the damage, this will be a long-term endeavor. It will need support by the widest possible group of states, and we hope that the structures and instruments can be put in place in a way to take this work forward, irrespective of the current membership of this treaty, whether state party or not, and this applies to the potential donor states as well as to the beneficiaries. As others have said, this is an area where we should explore complementarities and synergies, and we hope this issue will be taken forward at the 10th Review Conference, since humanitarian consequences should unite us all. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland. I see no further requests for floor. Section 4 of the working paper TPNW/MSP/2022 working paper 5 contains recommendations. The contents of that section have been taken up in the working paper on the intersessional process and in the draft Vienna Action Plan. May I take it that it's the wish of the meeting to conclude its consideration of sub-item D of the agenda item 11? If I see no objection, it's so decided. The meeting will now resume its consideration of agenda item 8, entitled Organization of Work. Notwithstanding the program of work contained in document TPNW/MSP/2022/INF/3, I propose that the meeting proceed immediately to consider sub-item F of the agenda item 11 before concluding this afternoon meeting. May I take it that it is the wish of the meeting to proceed accordingly? If I see no objection, it's so decided. The meeting has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of agenda item 8. The meeting will now consider sub-item F, entitled National Implementation Measures, Article 5, of the agenda item 11, entitled Consideration of the Status and Operation of the Treaty and Other Matters Important for Achieving the Objective and Purposes of the Treaty. No document have been submitted under this item. Does any delegation wish to take the floor? I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nuclear Ban US. You have the floor.
Sorry, I'm not quite ready. I will be there 1 second. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak on this agenda item. Article 5 calls on all the states parties to take all appropriate legal, administrative, and other measures to implement their other obligations under the treaty. And this can and should include steps to provide victim assistance and/or environmental remediation as obligated by Article 6, and measures to assist other countries in providing that assistance as obligated by Article 7, which I believe has already been discussed. But Article 5 goes beyond this by calling on all states parties to implement legal measures, including the imposition of penal sanctions to prevent and suppress any activity prohibited to a state party under this treaty, undertaken by persons or on territory under its jurisdiction and or control. We already know that the existing state parties in this room are in full compliance with their Article 1 obligations as state parties. But the nuclear weapons business is not just conducted by states. There are at least 24 international corporations who are responsible for developing, building, and maintaining nuclear weapons on behalf of the nuclear weapon states. There are universities and research institutions who are responsible for the research that goes directly into the development and production of nuclear weapons. And in relation to Article 1E, the prohibition to assist, encourage, or induce in any way anyone to engage in any of the prohibited activities, it is important to point out that there are numerous suppliers, lobbyists, financial backers, and others who enable and make possible the continued development, production, and maintenance of nuclear weapons. So while it may be the case that as a state party, your government is in full compliance with the TPNW, there could well be individuals and or corporations operating in your country who are engaging directly in the development, testing, or maintenance of nuclear weapons. If we are serious about the goal of eliminating these weapons once and for all from the face of the earth, the prohibitions enshrined in Article 1 of the TPNW must be applied to individuals and to corporations as well as to national governments. And if we want those individuals and corporations to take these prohibitions seriously, we must have penal sanctions in place to be able to prosecute them when they do not take them seriously. So I leave you with 5 requests from ICANN colleagues who are committed to supporting all member states in their national implementation of the treaty. The first is that the prohibitions of the TPNW must be incorporated into national legislation in such a way to ensure that these prohibitions have legal status at the national level and can be used to prosecute violations of those prohibitions. That's the first. Number 2, the prohibitions of the TPNW should be clearly and unequivocally made to apply to individual persons and not just to states parties, because those individuals can be held accountable under national laws of the state. Number 3, when corporate bodies are responsible for a violation of the law, the directors, managers, and other officers of those corporate bodies must be held accountable for the actions of their corporate body. Number 4, it is then essential, as obligated by Article 5, to assign penalties for any violation of these prohibitions. Assigning the maximum possible penalties for individual violations is the surest way to ensure effective enforcement of those prohibitions. And I can point here to the maximum penalty for violating the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Act in Ireland of 2019, which is life imprisonment. We know that nuclear weapons are not an effective deterrent when it comes to convincing other countries that they should or should not behave in certain ways. But if I were thinking of taking on a nuclear weapons contract in Ireland, I would definitely think twice about it if I knew the penalty could be life in prison. That's what I call a deterrent. And finally, we strongly urge state parties to define the financing of prohibited activities as a form of assistance in the meaning of Article 1E. Many of the states parties in this room have done this already in relation to other treaties, like the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Whether this is done in the context of national legislation or as a standalone public declaration, as many of you have done, it is critical to the success of this treaty that the financing of nuclear weapons becomes as stigmatized as the weapons themselves. And we have heard in this room on Tuesday from asset managers responsible for 230 billion euros worth of investments that they are now ready to join the 101 financial institutions around the world who together represent more than 1.29 trillion euros who have already begun divesting from the nuclear weapons industry. As they say in the United States, if you want to make effective change, follow the money. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nuclear Ban US. Ahora le doy el uso de la palabra al distinguido.
I'll now give the floor to the distinguished delegate from Cuba. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Co-President. We were prepared to speak under this item tomorrow, but given that we're working ahead of time, and in order that we can continue with the meeting, we can make a few preliminary comments now. And we would like to state in this respect that our delegation, Cuba, defends the intention behind all of the different provisions of the treaty. We would like to reassert the central role that national governments should play, those of states parties that is, to comply with the provisions of the treaty in their territory. We would like to underscore that a proportion of Cuban national territory in the Guantanamo province is illegally occupied by the United States. And on this territory, the Cuban state does not have jurisdiction. As a result of this, we cannot accept any responsibility when it comes to the existence on this territory of nuclear weapons or other nuclear devices. We do not support the legitimization of export controls that are not multilaterally discussed. Finally, we support the establishment of a voluntary international cooperation fund, and we think that this fund should include the creation of legislative capabilities. Thank you very much.
Agradezco mucho.
Thank you very much, Cuba, for that statement.
Give the floor to the distinguished representative of the ICRC. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for giving the ICRC the floor. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the adoption of legal, administrative, and other measures at national level to implement the key obligations of the treaty is a priority. This may involve the adoption by state parties of criminal legislation, including the imposition of penal sanctions to ensure respect for the treaty's provisions within their territory and by persons under their jurisdiction or control. In addition, states parties must take measures towards the provision of victim assistance, environmental remediation, and international assistance and cooperation, among others, in accordance with the respective obligations under the treaty. The ICRC is firmly committed to promoting the treaty's faithful implementation and stands ready to assist states in developing their national legislation. In addition to a ratification kit to facilitate the process of joining the treaty, we have developed various tools, including a model law to assist state parties in drafting a new legislation compatible with the TPNW, a legal fact sheet describing the essential elements of the treaty in a concise manner, as well as adapted model declarations to support states in meeting their obligations under Article 2 of the treaty. As always, the ICRC remains available to provide states with technical support and advice on the implementation of the treaty through the ICRC's advisory services on IHL in Geneva, our delegations in capitals around the world, as well as our delegation to the United Nations in New York. Such support can take the form of drafting workshops with concerned state authorities, briefings with parliamentarians, provisions of a platform for peer-to-peer support between states, and the organization of regional events to promote the faithful implementation of the treaty. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the ICRC. I see no further requests for the floor. May I take it that it's the wish of the meeting to conclude its consideration of sub-item F of agenda item 11? I see no objection. It's so decided. Following this agenda item, please, I will give the floor to the Secretary General for an announcement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I just would like to advise that on behalf of the President, a document will be circulated this evening to all delegations containing the draft decisions to be adopted at the rest of the meeting. Thank you.
On behalf of Ambassador Clement, I would like to thank you very much, all the participants, for achieving so much today. The next meeting will take place tomorrow morning, promptly at 10 o'clock in this hall. This meeting is adjourned.
Muchas gracias, señor. Al contrario.